You passed every exam. You aced every date, every name, every oversimplified story your teacher put on the board, and almost none of it was the full truth. Here are 44 American history myths your school never corrected. 1. You were taught that Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492 and discovered a brand new continent that nobody knew existed, and for some reason, this story survived long enough to become a national holiday. Columbus never set foot on North American soil. Not once. He landed in the Bahamas, visited Cuba and Hispaniola, and died believing he had reached Asia. The continent was already home to roughly 100 million people living across complex civilizations with trade networks, cities, and calendars that Europeans hadn't imagined yet. You cannot discover a place that is already occupied by 100 million people unless you have made a very specific and very convenient decision about who counts. Norse explorer Leif Erikson had already established a settlement at L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland around the year 1000, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus left port. The continent wasn't even named after Columbus. It was named after Amerigo Vespucci, the explorer who correctly identified it as a separate landmass rather than the outer edges of Asia. Columbus got the holiday because his voyages opened sustained contact between hemispheres, which is genuinely historically significant. But the discovery framing requires you to look directly at 100 million people and decide they don't count as evidence that someone was already home. Crediting Columbus with discovering America is like crediting the first tourist to walk into a packed stadium with discovering the game already in progress. 2. You drew this scene in crayon at least a dozen times. Pilgrims in buckle hats, a long wooden table, grateful Native Americans sharing a harvest feast, and everyone giving thanks together in peaceful colonial harmony. Here is what actually happened. The 1621 gathering lasted 3 days and was attended by roughly 90 Wampanoag men who showed up because they heard English colonists firing weapons and came to investigate, not because they were invited to a celebration. They brought their own food because the colonists didn't have enough. The Wampanoag were already in a deteriorating and coercive political relationship with the Plymouth colony at the time of this feast. Nobody called it Thanksgiving. It was not an annual tradition. Earlier documented Thanksgiving observances occurred in Virginia in 1619 and Florida in 1565, decades before Plymouth entered the story at all. The holiday wasn't nationally standardized until Abraham Lincoln declared it in 1863 during the Civil War, primarily for wartime morale. The iconic imagery you memorized, the buckle hats, the black and white clothing, the long communal table, was largely invented by 19th century illustrators who weren't there and weren't particularly concerned with accuracy. The Thanksgiving your school sold you is less a historical record and more a 19th century marketing campaign with a turkey mascot, which has been running successfully for so long that questioning it still feels vaguely unpatriotic. 3. George Washington had wooden teeth. You have heard this your entire life, probably repeated it with confidence at some point, and it is completely wrong. Washington's dentures were never wood. The actual list of materials is considerably more disturbing than timber. His dentures were constructed from human teeth, some of which were purchased from enslaved people, combined with cow teeth, horse teeth, elephant ivory, and hippopotamus ivory, all held together with metal springs. He began losing his teeth in his 20s and had exactly one natural tooth remaining by the time of his first inauguration. The wooden myth likely spread because ivory dentures stained significantly over time and developed a grained wood-like appearance that confused people who were looking at them from a distance or in portraits. Washington's dental pain was not a minor inconvenience. It affected his public speaking noticeably, and the discomfort of his ill-fitting jaw visibly altered the shape of his face in official portraits. His denture sets were crafted by dentist John Greenwood and required constant and painful adjustment throughout his presidency. The truth about Washington's teeth involves enslaved people's extracted molars being repurposed into the mouth of the man who owned them, which is a significantly darker story than Wood. That is probably why everyone quietly agreed to stick with the lumber version. It's tidier. It fits on a trivia card. It doesn't require you to sit with what it actually implies. 4. One brave patriot on one horse, riding alone through the dark Massachusetts countryside, screaming a warning that ignited the American Revolution. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow told you so in a poem, and the poem became more famous than the actual event. Paul Revere was one of at least 40 riders who participated in alarm networks the night of April 18, 1775. He did not ride alone. He was joined immediately by William Dawes, and later Samuel Prescott entered the mission. Revere was captured by a British patrol before he ever reached Concord. It was Samuel Prescott who actually completed the ride to Concord and delivered the warning. As for the famous phrase, colonists at that time still considered themselves British subjects. The warning almost certainly referenced the regulars, meaning British Army troops, not the British, which would have been a confusing thing to shout at fellow British subjects. Longfellow's 1861 poem was written 86 years after the event, contained deliberate historical inaccuracies, and was composed to rally Union sentiment before the Civil War. It was political poetry dressed as historical record. Revere himself never published a widely read personal account of his ride during his lifetime. Paul Revere got the most famous credit in American history for a mission he didn't finish, which makes him either a legend or the historical equivalent of someone who starts a group project, disappears before it's due, and still gets their name on the poster. 5. On January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation and slavery ended. Your textbook devoted roughly one paragraph to this, moved on, and left you with the impression that a single executive signature resolved the defining moral catastrophe of American history. The Emancipation Proclamation freed no one in practice on the day it was signed. It applied only to Confederate states, the exact states where the Union government had zero actual authority or enforcement capacity at that moment. Enslaved people in border states that remained in the Union, including Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, and Delaware, were explicitly excluded from the proclamation entirely. The document was issued as a wartime executive order, not a constitutional amendment, meaning its long-term legal permanence was genuinely uncertain. Actual, legally permanent emancipation required the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December 1865, nearly 3 full years after the proclamation. Some enslaved people in Texas didn't receive word of their freedom until June 19, 1865, a date now commemorated as Juneteenth. The Emancipation Proclamation was a critical and strategically courageous wartime measure that reframed the conflict and had genuine consequences. But calling it the end of slavery is like celebrating the announcement that a fire has been put out while the building is still actively burning and the fire department won't arrive for 3 more years. 6. All the colonists, united as one, threw off the chains of British tyranny with collective righteous fury. The people versus the crown, and the people won together. This is the version with the dramatic lighting and the stirring orchestral score. Historians estimate that roughly 1/3 of colonists actively supported the revolution, 1/3 remained loyal to Britain, and 1/3 tried to stay completely uninvolved. Loyalists, colonists who supported the British crown, numbered between 15 and 20% of the white colonial population, according to conservative estimates, with other historians placing the number higher. Between 60,000 and 80,000 loyalists fled to Canada, Britain, or the Caribbean after the revolution concluded, representing one of the largest refugee movements in North American history at the time. The Continental Army struggled constantly with enlistment shortages, desertion, and chronic underfunding. Washington frequently wrote desperate letters about men abandoning the cause mid-campaign. Several major battles involved Americans fighting Americans, loyalist militias versus patriot militias, particularly throughout the Southern campaigns, where the conflict had the character of a civil war more than a unified uprising. The Revolution was far closer in social texture to a deeply divided civil conflict than the unanimous popular uprising mythology suggests. The United Colonies framing is doing an enormous amount of historical heavy lifting over a population that was roughly as divided as any contentious modern election, which does not make for a clean origin story, but does make for an honest one. 7. Benjamin Franklin flew a kite. Lightning struck it. Electricity traveled down the string to a key, and electricity was discovered by a clever man in Philadelphia with a dream and a storm. This story is in American classrooms, on inspirational posters, and in cultural shorthand for scientific genius. Franklin did not discover electricity. Electrical phenomena had been studied and documented by scientists including William Gilbert in 1600, Otto von Guericke in the 1660s, and Stephen Gray in the 1720s, all well before Franklin conducted any experiments. What Franklin actually did was demonstrate that lightning was electrical in nature, which is genuinely important, but is a very different thing from discovering electricity itself. His 1752 kite experiment, which he may not have conducted himself in the famous form, since no witnesses were present, demonstrated the electrical character of lightning specifically. Franklin's actual landmark contribution was the lightning rod, a practical invention based on his understanding of electrical conduction that saved countless buildings and ships from destruction. He also developed foundational electrical terminology still in everyday use today: positive, negative, battery, conductor, and charge. The experiment itself was reportedly first conducted successfully in France by Thomas-François Dalibard before Franklin's version. Franklin didn't discover electricity any more than the first person to cook with fire discovered heat. He figured out something critical about how one version of it moves. That's significant enough without the mythology layered on top. 8. Every Western film, every television show, every dime novel handed you the same image without exception: a white cowboy on a horse, riding the open range, embodying the American frontier. That was the West. Or rather, that was the version Hollywood decided to sell for a century. Historians estimate that approximately 1 in 4 cowboys on the post-Civil War cattle drives was black. After the Civil War, formerly enslaved men entered the cattle industry in large numbers because it was one of the few skilled labor fields with relatively equal pay and relatively less rigid racial hierarchy than other industries. Beyond that, the cowboy culture itself, the vocabulary, the techniques, the rodeo traditions, the lasso, the cattle drive practices, was largely developed by Mexican vaqueros, whose traditions predated Anglo settlement by generations. Notable black cowboys include Bill Pickett, who invented bulldogging, a rodeo technique also called steer wrestling, and became a legend in the sport. Nat Love published a celebrated autobiography documenting his life on the frontier. Bass Reeves, a formerly enslaved man, became one of the most effective United States Marshals in the West, and is widely considered a likely inspiration for the Lone Ranger character. The whitewashing of the American West in 20th century popular culture was not accidental. It was a deliberate commercial and cultural choice, driven by Hollywood studio economics and audience expectations. The cowboy mythology Hollywood sold, You, was essentially a sequel that erased most of the original cast, and then pretended the first film never existed. 9. Here is a myth that belongs in an American history video, specifically because it appeared in American school books for decades as a verified fun fact. You can see the Great Wall of China from space with the naked eye. This was treated as settled, impressive trivia. Multiple astronauts have directly confirmed it is false. No human being has ever seen the Great Wall from space without optical instruments. The claim first appeared in print in 1932 in Ripley's Believe It or Not, written decades before humans had ever gone to space, by someone who was therefore guessing. The wall averages only 15 to 30 feet wide, making it far too narrow to resolve from low Earth orbit without a telescope or camera zoom. Chinese astronaut Yang Liwei specifically looked for the wall during his 2003 mission. He could not see it. He publicly said so. NASA has confirmed the wall is not visible to the naked eye from the International Space Station under normal conditions. Despite all of this, the claim remained in American educational materials well into the 2000s, treated as a fascinating fact rather than a fabrication. The Great Wall of China being presented as verified truth in American textbooks for roughly 70 years is an object lesson in how impressive-sounding falsehoods become institutionalized. It gets repeated, it sounds credible, nobody checks, and eventually it's on a laminated classroom poster next to the multiplication table. 10. The founders built a Christian nation on Christian principles, and every one of those powdered wig patriots was a devout, church-going believer whose faith directly shaped the republic. This gets repeated in political speeches, educational contexts, and cultural debates with remarkable confidence for a claim that the founders' own writings contradict at considerable length. Many of the most prominent founders were deists. They believed in a creator God, but rejected organized religion, biblical miracles, and divine revelation as sources of governance. Thomas Jefferson literally cut apart a Bible with scissors, removing every supernatural event and miracle, and assembled what is now called the Jefferson Bible, a document containing only Jesus' moral teachings with the divinity entirely removed. Benjamin Franklin was a deist who rarely attended church and expressed documented skepticism about the divine nature of Jesus. George Washington almost never took communion and consistently referred to God using impersonal deist language like providence and the grand architect, not specifically Christian terminology. James Madison, the primary author of the Constitution, was a forceful advocate for strict separation of church and state and openly opposed government entanglement with religion throughout his career. The Constitution itself contains 0 references to Christianity, Jesus, or the Bible, an omission that was completely deliberate. Calling the founders a unified coalition of devout Christians requires ignoring the actual writings they left behind at a heroic and sustained level of determined effort. 11. After a long day of work, an exhausted seamstress sat down on a Montgomery bus, was too tired to move when asked to give up her seat, and accidentally sparked the civil rights movement through a spontaneous act of personal fatigue. Rosa Parks herself pushed back against this narrative repeatedly. She said it wasn't her feet that were tired. It was her soul. Parks was a trained civil rights activist, not a woman who stumbled into history by accident. She had attended the Highlander Folk School, a civil rights training center in Tennessee, just months before her December 1955 arrest. She served as secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP and was actively involved in civil rights strategy at the organizational level. The NAACP had been deliberately looking for the right plaintiff to challenge bus segregation laws in court. Earlier candidates had been considered and passed over for strategic reasons, including 15-year-old Claudette Colvin. Parks was selected partly because of her strong community standing, her dignified public presence, and her unimpeachable character as a legal plaintiff. The Montgomery bus boycott that followed her arrest was not a spontaneous eruption of public anger. It was a 381-day organized campaign requiring extraordinary logistical coordination, carpooling networks, community fundraising, and sustained leadership. Reducing Rosa Parks to a tired woman with sore feet is not a tribute. It is a way of making a calculated act of political courage sound like an accidental nap, which serves the mythology and disrespects the woman simultaneously. 12. July 4th. Fireworks. Independence. The founders gathered, signed the famous parchment, rang the Liberty Bell, and America was born. You have celebrated this your entire life on the assumption that something historically decisive happened on that specific date. Most delegates did not sign the Declaration on July 4th. The Continental Congress actually voted for independence on July 2nd, 1776. John Adams, who was present, predicted in a letter to his wife that July 2nd would be the date celebrated as the great American holiday for generations to come. He was wrong by 2 days, and nobody celebrates July 2nd. July 4th is the date Congress approved the final wording of the Declaration, not the date it was physically signed by the delegates assembled. The formal signing ceremony occurred on August 2nd, 1776, for most delegates. Several signers added their names even later than that. Thomas McKean, one of the signers, may not have signed the document until 1781, 5 years after independence. The Liberty Bell did not ring on July 4th, 1776. That association was fabricated in an 1847 piece of historical fiction by author George Lippard, which was subsequently accepted as fact and embedded itself into national mythology. July 4th is the date America approved the paperwork. The signatures came a month later, which means the national birthday party has been happening on the approximate date, not the exact one, for 250 years, and nobody seems particularly interested in correcting the cake. 13. Before Europeans arrived, the continent was a vast, unclaimed wilderness dotted with small, simple tribal societies that hadn't meaningfully advanced beyond basic survival. That is the picture most American education painted, either explicitly or by omission. It is wrong in ways that are not minor. Pre-contact North America contained sophisticated urban centers, complex agricultural systems, long-distance trade networks, and political confederacies that directly shaped democratic thought in the Western world. Cahokia, located near present-day St. Louis, was a city of an estimated 20,000 people at its peak, around 1100 AD, larger than London at the same point in history. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the Iroquois, was a sophisticated democratic governing structure uniting 6 distinct nations under a shared constitution called the Great Law of Peace. Historians, including Benjamin Franklin, explicitly acknowledged the Haudenosaunee model when discussing federal governance structures for the American colonies. The Three Sisters agricultural system, planting corn, beans, and squash together as companion crops, was a complex ecological technique that sustained large populations across the continent. Indigenous people actively managed landscapes through controlled burning, meaning the open wilderness Europeans encountered was often deliberately maintained agricultural and hunting land, not accidental nature. Extensive trade routes connected populations from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, with goods including copper, obsidian, and shells traveling thousands of miles. Calling pre-contact indigenous civilization primitive while marveling at 14th century European castles is a grading system where the rubric only ever works in one direction. 14. The Civil War was a constitutional conflict about federal overreach versus state sovereignty. Slavery was certainly part of the picture, but the real underlying issue was states' rights. The right of southern states to govern themselves without federal interference. You may have heard this version presented as reasonable historical nuance in certain classrooms. It is not nuance, it is revisionism, and the Confederacy's own founding documents disprove it directly. Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens delivered what became known as the Cornerstone Speech in March 1861, explicitly stating that slavery, not states' rights in any abstract sense, was the cornerstone and the foundations upon which the Confederacy was built. Multiple state declarations of secession from Mississippi, Georgia, Texas, and South Carolina specifically cite the threat to the institution of slavery as the primary reason for leaving the Union. The states' rights argument is also internally contradictory. The Confederacy overrode Southern states' rights on issues like military conscription and fought bitterly against states that attempted to limit Confederate central authority. The lost cause historical revisionism that reframed the war as being about abstract constitutional principle emerged decades after the war's end, promoted deliberately by former Confederate leaders as a political rehabilitation effort. The Confederate Constitution explicitly protected slavery and prohibited any Confederate state from abolishing it, which is, by definition, a limitation on states' rights. The Civil War was about states' rights is a sentence that requires you to pretend the Confederacy's own leaders didn't write down exactly what they were fighting for. 15. Albert Einstein failed mathematics as a child. This story appears in motivational speeches, inspirational classroom posters, self-help books, and commencement addresses. It has been deployed to comfort underperforming students and encourage creative thinkers for decades. It belongs in this video because it has circulated through American educational media long enough to become institutional mythology. Einstein was exceptional at mathematics from a very early age. He mastered calculus by age 15, according to his own written account. He did fail an entrance exam, but the exam was for the Swiss Federal Polytechnic School in Zurich, and the portions he struggled with were French language and botany, not mathematics. His mathematics and physics scores on that same exam were exceptional by any standard. Einstein reportedly found the myth personally offensive when he encountered it published in an article during his own lifetime, and said directly that it was a lie. The most likely explanation for the confusion involves the Swiss grading scale. Einstein studied under a system where 6 was the highest possible grade. After the system changed, his old scores appeared to be failures to anyone unfamiliar with the original scale, a misreading that someone then repeated without checking, and which then spread without correction. Putting "Einstein failed math" on an inspirational poster is the intellectual equivalent of citing a misquote as a caption. It feels motivating right up until someone actually checks the source, which apparently not enough people did for long enough that it became a standard fact. 16. Fed-up colonists, angry about being taxed by a government they had no vote in, stormed Boston Harbor and dumped the tea. Taxation without representation. Simple, principled, heroic. The most famous protest in American history explained in one clean sentence. The Tea Act of 1773 actually lowered the price of tea for American colonists. Read that again. The law that triggered the Boston Tea Party made tea cheaper. The real grievance was not the tax rate. It was the British East India Company's government-granted monopoly, which gave that one company the right to sell tea directly to American colonists, while bypassing colonial merchants entirely. Those merchants, many of whom were among the wealthiest and most politically connected patriots, stood to lose enormous business to a government-backed monopoly that they couldn't compete with. The protest was driven significantly by merchant self-interest, alongside principled opposition to the monopoly structure itself. The Sons of Liberty, who carried out the Boston Tea Party, disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians, a choice layered with deliberate symbolism that historians still analyze. 342 chests of tea were destroyed, worth approximately 10,000 pounds. The participants were careful to damage nothing else on the ships and reportedly swept the decks clean afterward. The Boston Tea Party was a principled protest against monopoly power with a substantial side order of merchant economics, which is a more complicated story than "we hate taxes." So schools simplified it aggressively and kept the version that fits on a commemorative mug. 17. Betsy Ross, a Philadelphia seamstress, was personally approached by George Washington, designed the iconic Stars and Stripes flag from scratch, and stitched the nation's most enduring symbol into existence. It is a compelling origin story with a specific protagonist, a famous supporting character, and a satisfying creative moment. There is no contemporary documentary evidence for any part of it, not the meeting, not the design, not the commission. The story was first presented publicly in 1870 by William Canby, Betsy Ross's grandson, in a speech to the Historical Society of Pennsylvania. That was 94 years after the alleged event, delivered by a family member with an obvious interest in the narrative. No historical documents from the 1770s mention Ross's role in creating the national flag. The Continental Congress's flag resolution of June 14, 1777 established the design specifications, but named no designer and no maker. Francis Hopkinson, a New Jersey delegate to the Continental Congress and designer of other official American symbols, submitted a bill to Congress in 1780, claiming credit for designing the flag. Congress denied the payment but did not dispute his involvement claim. Betsy Ross did make flags for the Pennsylvania Navy and was a skilled flag maker. That is documented. The specific Washington meeting, the design session, the five-pointed star innovation she supposedly suggested. None of that has any paper trail outside of a grandson's speech nearly a century later, which is a fragile foundation for a national icon and a robust foundation for a tourist attraction. 18. The Salem Witch Trials. Puritan Hysteria. 1692, Massachusetts. Women burned at the stake. This image is so thoroughly embedded in American cultural shorthand that it appears in Halloween decorations, psychology metaphors, and political rhetoric as a reference point for mob mentality. Not a single person was burned at the stake in Salem. Not one. 19 people were executed by hanging at Proctor's Ledge in Salem, Massachusetts in 1692. One man, Giles Corey, refused to enter a plea and was subjected to a process called pressing. Heavy stones were placed on his chest over the course of 2 days in an attempt to force him to respond. He died reportedly saying, "More weight." 5 additional accused individuals died in prison while awaiting trial. The burning at the stake execution method was associated with European witch trials, particularly in Germany and Scotland, not with New England Puritan legal practice. American colonists used hanging. The Salem trials lasted less than a year before colonial governor William Phipps dissolved the special court, notably in part because his own wife had been accused, which appears to have sharpened his skepticism considerably. The Salem witch trials are genuinely horrifying, without needing a borrowed European execution method grafted onto them. The burning at the stake image is a European import pasted over an American event, which means even the mythology about Puritan horror managed to get the specific horror wrong. 19. America saw the evil of fascism, answered the moral call of history, and entered World War II to stop tyranny and defend democracy. The righteous cavalry arrived, if belatedly. The United States government maintained official neutrality for over 2 years after Germany invaded Poland and the Holocaust was underway. The U.S. entered the war only after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. 2 days later, after Germany declared war on the United States first, did the U.S. turn its attention to Europe. In 1939, the ocean liner SS St. Louis was carrying 937 Jewish refugees, fleeing Nazi Germany. It was turned away from American shores. The passengers were forced to return to Europe. Many of them later died in the Holocaust. The State Department actively suppressed information about the Holocaust from reaching the public and the president in the early 1940s. Simultaneously, the same government fighting fascism abroad was interning 120,000 Japanese American citizens in domestic detention camps based on race, not evidence. America's entry into World War II was the right outcome that happened for complicated, reactive, and sometimes self-interested reasons, not because the government saw a genocide beginning and charged in as an ideological crusader. That is a tidier story than the historical record supports, which is probably why it became the standard version taught to every American child. 20. The West was wilderness, open land. Manifest destiny simply meant Americans filling in blank spaces of the continent with civilization, roads, and progress. That is the framing absorbed through 100 years of frontier mythology, and it rests entirely on the decision to render millions of existing inhabitants invisible. The land was not empty. The U.S. government signed over 500 treaties with native nations. Every single one was violated by the United States. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 resulted in the forced relocation of the 5 civilized tribes from the American Southeast. The Cherokees' forced westward march became known as the Trail of Tears, during which an estimated 4,000 of 15,000 Cherokee died from disease, exposure, and exhaustion. The 1887 Dawes Act deliberately broke up communal tribal land into individual allotments, resulting in Native Americans losing approximately 90 million acres within 50 years, transferred to white settlers and corporations. The massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890 killed an estimated 250 to 300 Lakota Sioux, the majority of them women and children. 20 medals of honor were awarded to U.S. soldiers for that massacre, a fact Congress has repeatedly considered revoking, and has not. Calling the frontier empty land is only possible if you have already decided in advance that the people living there don't qualify as people for purposes of the accounting, which is the kind of math that requires a very particular set of assumptions to make work. 21. Thomas Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," wrestled with the moral contradiction of slavery, and was a conflicted man of his time who would have freed the people he enslaved if the economics and the social structure had simply allowed it. This framing positions Jefferson as a tragic idealist, constrained by circumstance, rather than a man who made choices. Jefferson owned more than 600 enslaved people over his lifetime. He freed 2 of them while he was alive. He freed 5 more in his will, all members of the Hemings family. Sally Hemings was enslaved by Jefferson, was the half-sister of his late wife, and was between 14 and 15 years old when her relationship with the then 44-year-old Jefferson began. She was legally his property, with no legal capacity to consent. DNA evidence confirmed in 1998 that Jefferson fathered at least one of Hemings's children. Jefferson's original draft of the Declaration of Independence included a passage condemning the slave trade, which was removed at the insistence of Southern delegates. Jefferson did not fight to keep it in. As a Virginia legislator, he strengthened slavery's legal protections, and as president, he did little to limit its westward expansion. Jefferson was conflicted about slavery is a sentence that asks you to locate the conflict in his private letters while looking away from what he did and did not do with every concrete opportunity he had over a 50-year public career. 22. Remember the Alamo. A heroic band of American freedom fighters held their ground and died defending liberty against a tyrannical Mexican army. It is one of the most romanticized battles in American history, invoked for generations as a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The defenders of the Alamo were fighting, in substantial part, to preserve slavery, a practice Mexico had abolished in 1829. American settlers who had brought enslaved people into Texas were alarmed by Mexican anti-slavery enforcement and by Mexican government attempts to restrict further American immigration. These were central grievances driving the Texas Revolution, not abstract constitutional principle. Jim Bowie, one of the Alamo's most celebrated defenders, was a slave trader by profession before the battle. Several other defenders legally owned enslaved people. The Republic of Texas, upon achieving independence, explicitly enshrined slavery in its new constitution and reopened the slave trade, which had been illegal under Mexican governance. Davy Crockett's famous Last Stand is itself historically contested. Multiple Mexican accounts and at least one diary from the period suggest he was captured during the battle and subsequently executed, rather than dying heroically fighting to the last. Remember the Alamo is a powerful rallying cry that works most effectively as long as you do not ask precisely what the men inside were fighting to preserve, because that answer complicates the statue considerably. 23. America is the world's great democracy, and its foreign policy has consistently been about spreading freedom and self-determination to oppressed peoples around the globe. This is a foundational piece of American national identity, repeated in presidential speeches, taught in civics classes, and used to justify military action across 2 centuries. The U.S. government actively overthrew democratically elected governments in at least a dozen countries during the 20th century, primarily to protect economic interests or counter Soviet influence. In 1953, the CIA overthrew democratically elected Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh after he moved to nationalize Iran's oil industry. The U.S. reinstalled the Shah. In 1954, the CIA overthrew democratically elected Guatemalan President Jacobo Arbenz after his land reform policies threatened the United Fruit Company's extensive holdings in the country. In 1973, the U.S. supported and facilitated the Chilean military coup that overthrew elected President Salvador Allende on September 11, 1973. Allende died during the coup. During the 1980s, the U.S. provided intelligence and material support to Saddam Hussein's Iraq, including while knowing chemical weapons were being used against Kurdish civilians. Spreading democracy is an accurate description of stated American foreign policy intent in approximately the same way that describing a restaurant as health-focused would be accurate if they served one salad alongside an unlimited menu of everything else. Technically present in the branding, considerably less present in the actual operation. 24. The Underground Railroad was a network of literal underground tunnels where enslaved people were smuggled northward to freedom through hidden passageways beneath homes and churches. Some historic buildings still market this to tourists. The tunnels almost universally don't exist, and archaeologists have been quietly debunking them for decades. The Underground Railroad was a metaphorical application of railroad terminology to describe a clandestine network of people, routes, and safe houses, almost all of which were above ground, in plain sight, hidden in plain social anonymity rather than in literal basements. Conductors guided freedom seekers along routes through safe houses called stations. Harriet Tubman, the most celebrated conductor, made approximately 13 missions and helped free around 70 enslaved people using disguise, misdirection, timing, and extraordinary personal courage, not tunnels. The Underground Railroad tunnels, claimed by historic homes, have been systematically investigated and debunked by archaeologists repeatedly. The mythology grew in the late 19th and 20th centuries as communities sought historical significance for their properties. The network was dangerous, improvised, and unreliable, not an organized system, but a collection of individuals taking enormous personal risks with no guarantee of success. Most enslaved people who escaped did so without the network's help at all, relying instead on their own knowledge of the land, forged documents, or elaborate personal disguise. The Secret Tunnels version of the Underground Railroad is easier to build into a visitor experience, which is probably why it persisted long after historians pointed out the absence of actual tunnels. 25. Senator Joseph McCarthy was a delusional bully who saw Soviet spies behind every curtain, ruined innocent lives for political sport, and the entire Red Scare panic was baseless hysteria with no grounding in reality whatsoever. That is the standard version. It is incomplete in ways that matter for understanding how the hysteria was able to gain the traction it did. While McCarthy's tactics were destructive, reckless, and frequently targeted innocent people, Soviet espionage in the U.S. government during the 1940s was real, documented, and significant. The Venona Project, a collection of NSA decryption documents declassified in 1995, confirmed that the Soviet Union had extensive and effective spy networks operating inside the U.S. government. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were executed in 1953 for passing atomic bomb secrets to the Soviets. Later, Venona cables confirmed Julius's guilt. Alger Hiss, a senior State Department official, was convicted of perjury related to his espionage activities, and subsequent Venona evidence confirmed his Soviet contacts. McCarthy himself had almost no actual spy-catching success. His targets were frequently wrong, his evidence frequently fabricated, and his committee operated as spectacle rather than genuine investigation. The genuine espionage problem and McCarthy's reckless witch hunt existed simultaneously in the same political moment, which is exactly the kind of complexity that gets flattened into one clean narrative. McCarthy was using a real fire to justify burning down buildings that weren't on fire, which means both parts of that sentence are true at the same time. 26. American ingenuity, NASA brilliance, and the superior products of a free democratic society beat Soviet communism to the moon. The best system won because freedom produces better science and better engineers. The man who built the rocket that took Americans to the moon was a former Nazi SS officer named Werner von Braun, and the US government deliberately concealed that fact from the American public for decades. Operation Paperclip was a secret US government program that recruited over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians after World War II. Many of them held Nazi Party memberships. Some had documented involvement in war crimes. Von Braun, the architect of the Saturn V rocket that launched the Apollo missions, held the rank of major in the SS. His V-2 rockets during the war were built using concentration camp slave labor. Historians estimate that approximately 20,000 workers died during V-2 production, more people than the rockets killed in combat. Von Braun was given a carefully constructed American biography that sanitized his Nazi past. He was publicly celebrated as a visionary pioneer. The Soviet space program similarly recruited German rocket engineers from its occupied territories after the war. Both superpowers were, in effect, competing with each other using variations of the same inherited German rocket science. The moral clarity of the space race narrative becomes considerably more complicated when you look at who built the rocket and what he was doing before he got the job. 27. Gunfights at high noon. Bodies in the street every Saturday. The frontier was a blood-soaked killing field where life was cheap, law was whoever drew fastest, and civilization hadn't arrived yet. The mythology is so thick you can practically smell the gunpowder and the dramatic orchestral score. Most famous Wild West towns were statistically less violent than major eastern cities of the same era, and several had stricter gun control ordinances than many American cities do today. Tombstone, Arizona, home of the gunfight at the OK Corral, the single most famous violent event in frontier mythology, required visitors to check their firearms at the city limits. Dodge City, Kansas had similar ordinances restricting the carrying of weapons inside town. Historian Robert Dijkstra's research found that Dodge City averaged 1.5 murders per year during its most violent years in the 1870s. Deadwood, South Dakota, another legendary lawless town, averaged fewer than 2 murders per year at its peak. Eastern cities, including New York and Chicago, had significantly higher per capita murder rates during those same decades. The mythology of Wild West violence was largely created by dime novelists, Buffalo Bill's Wild West shows, and eventually Hollywood. Commercial entertainment sold to Eastern audiences who wanted drama and got it regardless of whether it was accurate. The Wild West was mostly just the regular West, and the place with the actual violence problem in the 1870s was considerably further east and considerably more urban. 28. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were bombed to force Japan's surrender and avoid a catastrophic land invasion that would have killed hundreds of thousands on both sides. It was a tragic but necessary decision made by leaders who had exhausted every other option. That is the standard American textbook version, and the historical record surrounding it is significantly more complicated than that framing allows. Japan had been attempting to negotiate a conditional surrender through the Soviet Union for months before the bombs were dropped, with the primary condition being the preservation of the emperor. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan on August 8, 1945, between the two bombings, and launched a massive invasion of Japanese-held Manchuria. Many historians argue this Soviet entry was equally or more decisive to Japan's final surrender calculation than the atomic bombs. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and several senior military leaders, including Admiral William Leahy, opposed the bombing as militarily unnecessary, given Japan's already deteriorating strategic position. The United States ultimately allowed Japan to retain the emperor as part of the surrender terms, the exact condition Japan had been requesting through diplomatic channels before either bomb was dropped. The bombs killed an estimated 110,000 to 210,000 people, the majority of them civilians. The only option framing of the atomic bombings is a tidier story than the historical record supports, which doesn't make the decision simple, but does make the textbook version incomplete in ways worth knowing. 29. In 1492, Christopher Columbus bravely challenged the flat earth believers of medieval Europe by sailing west to prove the world was round. He was a visionary, standing against the ignorance of his time, risking his life to overturn superstition with science. Educated Europeans had known the earth was spherical since ancient Greece. This was not a controversial or debated point in Columbus's time. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth with remarkable accuracy around 240 BC, using the angle of shadows in two different Egyptian cities and basic geometry. Medieval European scholars accepted a spherical earth without serious dispute. This is documented throughout centuries of academic and theological texts. The flat earth in the Middle Ages idea is itself a myth that was popularized in the 19th century and has no serious basis in medieval scholarship. The scholars who opposed Columbus's voyage were not defending a flat earth. They were arguing, correctly, that Columbus had dramatically underestimated the actual circumference of the spherical earth. Columbus estimated the westward distance to Asia from the Canary Islands at roughly 3,000 miles. The actual distance is approximately 12,000 miles. Columbus would have died at sea of starvation and thirst if the American continents had not been where they were not supposed to be. He stumbled onto land by accident, not by correct calculation. Columbus set sail with the wrong math, reached the wrong continent, died believing it was still the wrong place, and became a national hero for it, which is an inspirational story of a very specific and unusual kind. 30. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, they built their empires from nothing through genius, relentless hard work, and the superior outcomes of a system that rewards merit. The American dream in its purest form. Pure talent recognized and rewarded by a fair market. Gilded Age fortunes were built through government subsidies. Monopolistic practices designed specifically to eliminate competition, political corruption, and labor conditions that would be illegal under modern law. Cornelius Vanderbilt and the railroad barons received massive federal land grants. The Transcontinental Railroad was constructed on government-given land worth billions of dollars in contemporary terms, handed over as a subsidy. John D. Rockefeller built Standard Oil by negotiating secret railroad rebates. Private pricing arrangements with Vanderbilt's railroads that his competitors were denied access to. He used that structural advantage to undercut competitors systematically until he could absorb them. By 1880, Standard Oil controlled 91% of U.S. oil refining. The Supreme Court broke it up in 1911 as an illegal monopoly. Carnegie Steel's profits were built on 12-hour workdays, 7-day work weeks, and the violent suppression of union organizing. The Homestead Strike of 1892 involved Carnegie-hired Pinkerton agents engaging in armed conflict with striking workers. Child labor was standard across Gilded Age industries. Millions of children worked in mines, mills, and factories as a matter of ordinary industrial practice. The self-made mythology requires a creative reimagining of what self means when it includes government land grants, secret railroad deals, armed strikebreakers, and child workers doing the foundational labor. 31. The Bering Land Bridge. Ice Age hunters followed mammoths from Siberia across a land bridge into Alaska around 13,000 years ago. Simple, clean, settled science. The textbook version of how the Americas were peopled. The Bering Land Bridge theory remains part of the story, but archaeological evidence increasingly shows earlier arrival dates, multiple migration routes, and coastal sea pathways that complicate the single corridor narrative significantly. The Monteverde site in Chile shows evidence of human habitation dating to at least 14,500 years ago, before the interior ice-free corridor route through the Bering Land Bridge was even geographically viable given existing ice sheet positions. The Paisley Caves in Oregon yielded fossilized human DNA from coprolites dated to approximately 14,300 years ago, similarly predating the traditional model's timeline. Genetic and linguistic diversity among indigenous American populations across the continent suggests multiple migration events from different source populations, not a single founding group spreading outward from one entry point. Coastal migration by watercraft along what researchers call the Kelp Highway, a productive coastal ecosystem running along the Pacific shoreline, is increasingly supported by genetic data and archaeological finds. The skeletal remains known as Kennewick Man, discovered in Washington state, have genetic profiles that complicate simple single-origin migration models in ways researchers are still working to understand. The tidy, one bridge, one migration, one founding people story was always the version that fit neatly into a paragraph. The actual human story of populating an entire hemisphere across thousands of years was inevitably and obviously more complicated than that. 32. Prohibition was 13 years of Puritan overreach that accomplished nothing, created organized crime, and was universally ignored by a population that never stopped drinking. It is held up as the textbook example of government failing to legislate morality. The standard lesson being, don't try to ban things people want. Alcohol consumption dropped dramatically during Prohibition. Per capita consumption fell to roughly 30% of pre-Prohibition levels during the early years of the Volstead Act. Deaths from liver cirrhosis dropped approximately 60 to 70% between 1920 and 1929. Arrests for public drunkenness and alcohol-related domestic violence initially fell sharply in many cities. The narrative of total, complete failure is overstated in ways that prevent honest policy analysis. Organized crime did expand dramatically to fill the supply vacuum. Al Capone's Chicago empire was a direct and well-documented product of Prohibition economics. Enforcement was wildly inconsistent, and corruption was pervasive, particularly in urban areas, while rural regions showed considerably more compliance. Repeal came less from a general acknowledgement of moral failure and more from the stark fiscal reality of the Great Depression. The federal government desperately needed alcohol tax revenue back. Prohibition was a policy that produced measurable public health improvements in certain categories, while simultaneously generating catastrophic organized crime side effects and eventually becoming unenforceable. That is a more complicated story than total failure, and considerably less useful as a simple cautionary tale, which is probably why the simple version stuck. 33. In wartime, America's sons answered the call equally. Rich and poor alike. The draft was the great democratic equalizer, putting every family's stake in the game, regardless of wealth or status. Every generation has repeated this. The draft deferment system during the Vietnam era was systematically easier to navigate for wealthier, college-educated young men, and the working class and poor, particularly Black Americans, bore a disproportionate combat burden as a direct result. College enrollment provided automatic draft deferments throughout the Vietnam era, creating a direct financial incentive that only those who could afford higher education could access. Black Americans made up roughly 11% of the U.S. population, but constituted approximately 23% of combat deaths in the early years of the war, before policy adjustments were made in response to public criticism. 5 future presidents avoided Vietnam service through various means. Donald Trump received a bone spurs medical deferment. Bill Clinton used ROTC enrollment strategically. George W. Bush served in the Texas Air National Guard. Dick Cheney received 5 student deferments and stated openly that he had other priorities. And Joe Biden received an asthma deferment. Muhammad Ali was stripped of his heavyweight championship title and faced federal prison for refusing induction as a conscientious objector, while wealthier men used legal teams to navigate quieter exits from service. The draft lottery system introduced in 1969 was designed to be fairer, and the fact that it was introduced was itself an acknowledgement that the existing system was not. 34. Lady Liberty. Torch raised over New York Harbor, welcomed the tired and poor and huddled masses to the shores of freedom. The poem, the image, the enduring symbol of a nation with open arms. The Statue of Liberty was not designed as a welcome sign to immigrants. It was conceived as a monument to the Franco-American alliance and to the abolition of slavery following the Civil War. French sculptor Frédéric Auguste Bartholdi designed it as a celebration of shared Republican ideals between France and the United States, not as a statement about immigration policy. Emma Lazarus's poem The New Colossus, which contains the famous lines about the tired and poor, was written in 1883. It was not inscribed on the statue's pedestal until 1903, 17 years after the statue's dedication in 1886. The immigrant welcome narrative was added to the symbol retroactively by the poem, not designed into the monument originally. At Ellis Island, where millions of immigrants were processed, the inspection experience was frequently intimidating, physically invasive, and deliberately humiliating. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, passed while Lady Liberty was being constructed, explicitly barred an entire nationality from immigrating, rendering the welcome selective at best and ironic at worst. The Statue of Liberty as a universal welcome mat is one of America's most powerful symbols, and like many powerful symbols, it was applied to a history that was considerably more selective than the famous poem implies. 35, October 1929, the market crashed and America fell into the Great Depression. Cause and effect. The stock market as villain, everything else as aftermath. Your textbook put the crash in one paragraph and the depression in the next, implying a clean, linear relationship between the two events. The Great Depression's severity and decade-long duration were caused by a cascade of catastrophic policy failures that turned what could have been a serious recession into an economic catastrophe unlike anything the industrialized world had experienced. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates in 1931 to defend the gold standard, precisely the wrong response during a deflationary spiral, deepening the crisis dramatically at the exact moment contraction was occurring throughout the banking system. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930 raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods, triggering immediate retaliatory tariffs from trading partners and collapsing international trade at a moment when the economy could least absorb it. Over 9,000 banks failed between 1930 and 1933, destroying savings and credit for ordinary Americans across the country. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation did not yet exist, so there was no backstop. The Dust Bowl, caused by drought combined with decades of overfarming and degraded land management, displaced an estimated 3.5 million people from the Great Plains, compounding the economic collapse with a humanitarian crisis. Gross domestic product didn't return to 1929 levels until 1937, and unemployment remained above 14% until World War II military spending effectively ended it. Blaming the Depression on the crash is accurate as a starting point and incomplete as a complete explanation. 36, Martin Luther King Jr. now has a federal holiday, a monument on the National Mall, and his speeches are taught in schools across the country as foundational American texts. Surely, Americans recognized his greatness and his moral courage in real time while he was alive and leading. A 1966 Gallup poll found that 63% of Americans held an unfavorable opinion of King. He was more unpopular than popular with the American public at that point in his career. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover called King the most dangerous Negro in America and ran a years-long covert program called COINTELPRO, specifically designed to discredit, destabilize, and ultimately destroy King's public standing and personal life. The FBI sent King an anonymous letter in 1964 that encouraged him to commit suicide. King was wiretapped extensively, with the personal approval of Attorney General Robert Kennedy. His letter from Birmingham jail was not written to segregationists. It was written specifically in response to white moderate clergymen who urged him to slow down, be patient, and use more acceptable methods. His public opposition to the Vietnam War in 1967 cost him substantial political support from President Lyndon Johnson and many former liberal allies who had previously backed the civil rights agenda. The version of Martin Luther King Jr. that America now universally celebrates has been carefully edited of everything that made him genuinely threatening to enough people that nearly 2/3 of the country disapproved of him during his lifetime. 37. The Broadway musical Hamilton gave an entire generation a passionate attachment to Alexander Hamilton as a scrappy immigrant outsider fighting for ordinary Americans against entrenched power, the people's revolutionary champion. Hamilton was an unapologetic elitist who openly distrusted democracy, advocated at the Constitutional Convention for a president serving for life, and designed the American financial system specifically to benefit wealthy creditors and the merchant class over working people and small farmers. At the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton proposed a president and a Senate both serving for life, elected through a process weighted toward wealthy landowners. It was rejected by the other delegates as functionally monarchist. Hamilton wrote in explicit terms that the people are turbulent and changing. They seldom judge or determine right. His distrust of popular democratic participation was not a private reservation, but a stated, documented political philosophy. His financial plan, the assumption of state debts, and the creation of a national bank directly benefited wealthy speculators who had purchased depreciated war bonds from desperate veterans for pennies on the dollar. It was a significant transfer of wealth to the financial class, executed through government policy. Hamilton did oppose slavery more consistently than many of his contemporaries, which is genuine historical credit. His record there is real, but it doesn't override his fundamentally aristocratic political vision for how the Republic should actually function. Hamilton the Musical is one of the most effective rebranding operations in American cultural history, which Alexander Hamilton, the original master of political messaging, would probably have appreciated enormously. 38. America went to the moon in 1969, beat the Soviets, planted the flag, and came home. Neil Armstrong's One Small Step line, national pride, clean, triumphant, historic. The Apollo program was funded by Cold War geopolitical terror, built with the direct contributions of former Nazi engineers, achieved at the cost of 3 astronauts' lives in a preventable disaster, and then abandoned so completely that no human being has left low Earth orbit in over 50 years. The Apollo 1 fire on January 27, 1967, killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee during a routine launch pad test. A flammable atmosphere inside the command module, combined with NASA's rushed program timeline, caused the disaster. Apollo 13 in 1970 suffered an oxygen tank explosion that nearly killed all 3 astronauts. Survival required improvised engineering, extraordinary ground-based problem solving, and a meaningful element of luck. Wernher von Braun, the SS officer who built his wartime rockets using concentration camp labor, was the central figure in developing the Saturn V that made the lunar missions possible. NASA's budget peaked at 4.4% of the federal budget in 1966 and declined steadily afterward. The entire Apollo program was canceled in 1972. Apollo 17, in December of that year, was the last time a human being stood on the moon. It has now been over 50 years. America went to the moon 12 times in 4 years and then stopped completely, which suggests the mission was less about the moon and considerably more about who was watching from Moscow. 39, the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920. Women got the vote, and America became a more complete democracy. Suffrage achieved. The movement won. The 19th Amendment applied primarily to white women in practice. Black women in southern states were systematically prevented from voting through Jim Crow laws for another 45 years. Native American women couldn't vote in all states until 1962. The 19th Amendment prohibited denying the vote based on sex, but poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, and outright violence were deployed throughout the South to prevent black voters of all genders from exercising that right, regardless of what any amendment said. The mainstream suffrage movement itself was not unified on questions of race. Leaders including Elizabeth Cady Stanton made explicitly racist arguments in favor of white women's suffrage, sometimes framing it in opposition to black male suffrage using white supremacist language. Ida B. Wells, a black suffragist and journalist, was asked to march at the back of the 1913 suffrage parade in Washington, D.C., separated from the white women marchers. Native Americans weren't granted U.S. citizenship until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, and several states blocked them from voting anyway afterward. Arizona and New Mexico didn't allow Native Americans to vote until 1948. Meaningful voting access for Black Americans throughout the South required the Voting Rights Act of 1965, 45 years after the 19th Amendment was ratified. Women got the vote in 1920 is accurate for a narrower group than the statement implies, and the full story has chapters your textbook either skipped or compressed into a single sentence. 40. America's economic success is the triumph of free markets, limited government intervention, and the invisible hand of competition. The government stays out. Entrepreneurs compete freely. Prosperity follows, and the system rewards merit without interference. This is the foundational ideology of American economic identity. The American economy has been built through continuous, massive government intervention, tariffs, subsidies, land grants, industrial policy, and direct corporate bailouts, from the founding era to the present day without significant interruption. Alexander Hamilton's 1791 Report on Manufactures established the template for using government tariffs to protect American industries from foreign competition before the country was 15 years old. Directly, deliberately interventionist from the start. The Homestead Act of 1862 gave away 270 million acres of federal land, formerly native land, to settlers and railroad corporations, one of the largest government wealth transfers in the nation's history. The interstate highway system, launched in 1956, was a $425 billion federal infrastructure investment that shaped the entire American economy, the automobile industry, and the growth of suburban development in ways that private markets did not and would not have produced. The internet was created by DARPA, a Defense Department government research program, not by private entrepreneurs operating in a free market. The 2008 financial crisis ended with the federal government bailing out the largest private banks and insurance companies to the tune of $700 billion. America's free market has been the most government-subsidized, tariff-protected, federally underwritten economy in the developed world for most of its history, which makes the ideology considerably more selective than the mythology. 41. The Constitution established a firm wall between government and religion. America's secular democratic tradition runs back to the founders, and church and state have operated in their respective lanes throughout the nation's history. "In God We Trust" was not on American paper currency until 1957. "Under God" was not in the Pledge of Allegiance until 1954. Both editions happened during the Cold War as explicit cultural contrasts to Soviet atheism, political decisions made in a specific geopolitical moment, not timeless expressions of founding principle. The phrase "In God We Trust" was adopted as the official national motto by Congress in 1956 and added to all paper currency in 1957. The phrase "Under God" was inserted into the Pledge of Allegiance by an act of Congress in 1954. It was not part of the original 1892 pledge and wasn't part of the pledge for over 60 years of its existence. The U.S. Congress employs official chaplains paid by taxpayers who open every legislative session with a prayer, a practice that has survived multiple legal challenges. Tax exemptions for religious organizations represent an estimated $71 to $100 billion in foregone federal and state revenue annually. Blue laws restricting Sunday commerce based on Christian Sabbath observance remained active in many states well into the late 20th century. The separation of church and state is a genuine constitutional principle that American law has applied with considerable creative flexibility throughout its history, depending heavily on who was doing the applying and what year it happened to be. 42. Europe descended into war, and eventually America answered the call of freedom, crossed the Atlantic, and helped defeat German militarism. The noble, if belated entry of a democracy unwilling to stand aside while tyranny advanced. America's entry into World War I was heavily shaped by financial entanglements with Britain and France, a government propaganda campaign that manufactured public consent and resulted in the most severe domestic civil liberties crackdown in American history up to that point. American banks, led by J.P. Morgan, had lent approximately $2.3 billion to Britain and France by 1917. A German victory would have meant catastrophic financial losses for those creditors. The Committee on Public Information, also called the Creel Committee, was a government propaganda operation that produced war posters, planted favorable newspaper stories, and deployed 75,000 speakers, called 4-minute men, to give pro-war speeches in movie theaters across the country during real changes. The Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918 made it a federal crime to criticize the war, the military draft, or the government's conduct. Over 2,000 people were prosecuted under these laws. Socialist leader Eugene Debs was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for delivering an anti-war speech in Ohio in 1918. Approximately 1,500 German Americans were interned during the war, establishing a precedent that would be dramatically expanded against Japanese Americans in the next World War. America entered World War I to defend democracy while simultaneously imprisoning people for the democratic act of political speech, which is the kind of contradiction that tends not to make it onto the commemorative posters. 43. The founders created a brilliantly designed democratic document built on universal principles of freedom and equality that was visionary in its own time and has guided democratic governance ever since. The original Constitution explicitly counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person, built legal protections for the slave trade directly into its text, and created structural arrangements that gave slaveholding states disproportionate political power for generations. The 3/5 Compromise, written into Article 1, Section 2, counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for purposes of congressional apportionment. This gave slaveholding states more seats in the House of Representatives based on a population that those states simultaneously insisted had no rights, no citizenship, and no humanity worth legal recognition. The slave trade was constitutionally protected until at least 1808 under Article 1, Section 9. The founders explicitly wrote a 20-year protection for human trafficking into the founding document. The Electoral College was designed in part to give slaveholding states additional influence, since enslaved populations, counted at 3/5, boosted those states' electoral votes, even though enslaved people could not vote. The original Constitution contained no Bill of Rights. The first 10 amendments were demanded by multiple states as conditions of ratification, suggesting the initial document was considered inadequate by the people being asked to adopt it. Women, non-property owning men, and enslaved people had no political rights under the document as written. The Constitution is genuinely remarkable and has been amended 27 times, partly because the original version contained compromises its own authors knew were wrong and chose to defer rather than resolve. 44, the greatest generation, came home from defeating fascism, built the American middle class on the GI Bill, bought homes in the new suburbs, and lived the American dream as a nation honored every one of its heroes equally and without distinction. The GI Bill's transformative benefits were administered in ways that systematically excluded black veterans, producing one of the most consequential and deliberately underacknowledged racial wealth gaps in American history. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act of 1944 provided college tuition assistance, low-interest home loans, and business loans to veterans. Its administration was left to local institutions, which throughout the South and in many northern communities simply refused to provide services to black applicants. Most Southern colleges and universities refused to admit black GI Bill recipients. Northern universities maintained strict racial enrollment quotas that severely limited access. The Federal Housing Administration explicitly endorsed redlining, the practice of refusing to guarantee mortgages in black neighborhoods, meaning black veterans could not use their home loan benefits in the growing suburbs where wealth was being built. Roughly 1.2 million black Americans served in World War II. The gap in GI Bill access meant they were almost entirely excluded from the post-war wealth creation that built the white American middle class, producing an asset gap between white and black families whose effects are still measurable in economic data today. Black veterans who returned to Southern states were subject to the same Jim Crow laws as before their service. Some were attacked or killed while still wearing the uniform. The GI Bill built the American middle class the same way many great American promises have worked, exactly as advertised for some Americans, and nearly not at all for others. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.